Morning, everybody. This is book 2 of the morning, and hopefully this also works. I figured since our live classes today were canceled because of the crazy storm we had, we could, or I could spend some time reading the book we were going to read together so that at least you had an idea of what the book was about. And as we read, I can ask you some questions to just give you something to think about today. I wish we could do this live because I really wanted to see all of you guys and hear all of your answers, but at least we can do this and you guys can get started with your Flyleaf packets afterwards. So the book that group 2 and 3 are reading today is called Phil Can Read. And let's see if I can screen share. There we go. Phil Can Read, written by Laura Appleton Smith and illustrated by Meg McLean. So the interesting thing about this book is it is actually a poem. Do any of you remember what a poem is? They're different from stories, and poems are usually written in a series of lines on a page. Sometimes the lines rhyme with each other, which can make the poem sound more like a song when you read it out loud. And each section of a poem is called a stanza. When we flip to the next page, we'll count how many stanzas our poem has. But before we do that, just like storybooks, a poem also has an author. But an author who writes a poem is called a poet. And the poet who wrote Phil Can Read is, as we already said, Laura Appleton Smith. Okay. Before I flip the page, and as we're looking at the title of our poem, Phil Can Read, think about what this poem might be about. I'll give you a second to think about that. Okay, are we ready? All right, so before we read it, you have the title of the poem right here to remind us. Phil Can Read. So I have a feeling this poem is going to be about Phil, who must be that little boy in our illustration over here. And Phil can read. Why do you think Laura, our poet, wanted there to be an exclamation point at the end of her title? Phil must be very excited that he can read. That's my guess. Okay, and like I said earlier, a stanza, poem is made up of stanzas instead of paragraphs. And we can tell the difference from one stanza to the other by these little spaces in between. So let's count how many stanzas this poem has. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This poem has 5 stanzas. Okay, I'm going to read this to you guys. You can read along, and then I have a couple questions for afterwards, all right? Phil can read. Phil said, I can read because I know my alphabet. I know my letters from A to Z. Phil said, I can read because I know my phonics. I know that the letter B is for ball and bat and B, and zipper and zigzag, Z, Z, Z. Phil said, I could read to you. Come over and sit. I could read you paragraphs on elephants and rockets, dolphins and squids. I could read to you just like this. Phil said, I can read big words like fantastic and splendid. I know they are each words for good. I know that itty-bitty is little, and that to inspect is to look. Phil said, I can read. You can read too. Isn't it fantastic? Isn't it splendid? But stop. Oh no, now we can't read because all of the words have ended. That's a silly little poem. I like it though. Do you? So, who is our narrator in this poem? A narrator is the person that's telling the story. I'll give you a second to think. Phil. Phil is our narrator. Exactly. And the reason I know that he is our narrator is because the first line in every stanza says, it says, Phil said, I can read. When he says, I can read, it's him talking. That's how I know. Okay, let's find the evidence in this poem that tells us that Phil can read. Let's look at stanza 1. Phil says, I can read because I know my alphabet. If you know your alphabet, that's the first step of learning how to read, right? If you know the names of the letters and the sounds that they make, then you can put those together and sound out the words on the page. So that is our first bit of evidence that tells us that Phil knows how to read. Let's find evidence in stanza 2. Phil said, I can read because I know my phonics. Phonics, that's an interesting word. Do any of you know what that means? Similar to knowing your alphabet, phonics is knowing the sounds that each letter makes. So right here it says, I know that the letter B is for B, ball, and B, bat, and B, bee. So he recognizes that letter B makes the B sound. What other letter does he recognize the sound for in this stanza? Let's look at that last line in stanza 2. Z, Z, zipper, and zigzag. That's our second bit of evidence that Phil knows he can read. All right, let's look at stanza 3. Phil said, I could read to you. Come over and sit. I could read you paragraphs on elephants and rockets, dolphins and squids. I could read to you just like this. So he knows what a paragraph is, and a paragraph is a collection of sentences that makes a story. And it looks like he's choosing to read about different things. And so that is our other bit of evidence. Okay, now let's look at the fourth stanza and evidence for how he can read here. Phil said, I can read big words like fantastic and splendid. I know they are each words for good. So he realizes here that the words fantastic and splendid mean good. Do you remember the synonym cards that you saw in your packets from last week about how one word can have a lot of different meanings that all are the same but different levels of, it's either a deeper or more intense version of the same word? Fantastic and splendid are synonyms for good. So Phil knows that. That's interesting. Look, there's more synonyms here. He says, I know that itty bitty means little. That's a synonym for little. And that to inspect is to look. Inspecting something is looking for something. So he is using a lot of synonyms here. So there's some more evidence for him, for Phil, he knows how to read. Okay, let's look at the last two lines in stanza 5. The last two lines right here. But stop. Oh no, now we can't read because all of the words have ended. Let's stop and clarify our understanding of what Phil means when he says, now we can't read because all the words have ended. What do you think? Phil is explaining that reading is dependent on the words on the page. That's true, right? If there weren't any words on the page, we couldn't read anything. So when there are no more words, there's no more to read. So on our 5th stanza, Phil is saying that he can read because now there's no more words on the page for him to read. Interesting. Okay. Let's see, what other questions do I have? We talked about our synonyms. That was on stanza 4. I wonder what shade of meaning fantastic and splendid are. Do you think that's Strong, stronger, or strongest version for good. Fantastic. I feel like that might be the strongest version of good. And splendid, that might be a stronger version of good, but maybe not the strongest. It's up to you. Take a minute to think about it if you'd like. And I believe that is it for my notes on what I wanted to talk to you guys about. But maybe maybe we can think about the message of this poem. The message of this poem, if you were to ask me, would be reading is exciting and it can help you learn new information and improve your vocabulary. Vocabulary is basically like using synonyms to help you find different meanings for a word. That expands your vocabulary, gives you more words to use when you're writing, or it will help you understand more words when you're reading. That's what that is. So the message of this poem is that reading is exciting and it can help expand your vocabulary. And I believe that's all I have. Do any of you have any other ideas of what the message of this poem could be? Anyway, something to think about. I miss you guys this morning. I wish we could have done this together, but at least you will have this to look at if your power is on and your internet is working. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask. And today, if you don't mind uploading your day 1 on your Flyleaf packets, that would be wonderful. Okay, good to see you guys. I'm going to stop share and I'll see you guys tomorrow.